Budge!
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 Welcome to Budge, Behavioural Science and Nudge Theory in Business, Education and Life. I'm with Dr. Darren Coppin, psychologist, writer, speaker, and of course retired circus llama trainer. How are you, mate?
I'm very good. Yes, I had to quit that because I spit too much. But Paul Miles, Managing Director of the Busy Group, one of Australia's largest education, training and employment organisations, and of course former hairdresser to Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson.
That's where I get all my
Good
tips
to
from.
see you.
We first met about 8 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago. More like 10 years ago, actually, in a cafe in Sydney.
Pre-Tinder.
Yeah, it was. And basically because you created a company in the UK and then sort of brought it to Australia around nudge theory, behavioural insights into the employment sector. And it was enabling long-term unemployed people, how you could activate and help long-term unemployed people become engaged with work. And you had some incredible outcomes actually supporting long-term unemployed people get into work. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. We're going to talk about the in crowd. We're going to talk about why rich public school boys should hang out in the hood. And we're going to talk about, do employers hate the unemployed? A controversial one, which I'm going to straight away say no because of my job. Mate, so what did you first, how did you first come up with this notion of activating long-term unemployed people through behavioural science?
Yeah, I was managing director of an employment services company, and there were some things in the sector that had been driving us mad for years. First of all, why doesn't everyone want to work? There'd been no real answer to that. There's loads of jobs, and yet there's still unemployed people. What's going on?
Which, of course, is incredibly relevant today. We are down to about 4% unemployment. Massive amounts of vacancies out there, but we just can't activate still parts of our population to do this.
Yeah, and it's really complex. And yet when I spoke to ministers and what have you, sometimes they refer to the unemployed as if they're almost a separate race of people rather than just citizens like you and I under slightly different circumstances. I think you've been unemployed before in your life at some point.
Absolutely, yeah, of course I have.
Me as well.
Yeah, and I look forward to it in the future again, based on these podcasts.
Straight after these. But there were other things, like we've got such a nurturing sector where people do it as a vocation as much as a career and a job. But why is there one of the highest turnover rates of staff of any sector?
Yeah, it's huge, isn't it? I think you said to me the other day, 8 to 10 times higher than working on an oil rig.
Yeah, it's the oil rig turnover percentages is sub 10%, and it can be up to 30% a year in the employment services sector. It's just weird. And there are all sorts of other things. Like in the sector, we've kind of done what's gone on before. So what could we harness? Because there's probably few industries more focused on behavioural change than there is, and complexities than there is with employment services. So
you're in the UK. You've got, I know from memory, you used to literally have a number of mobile sort of career training centres that you take around the UK, sort of helping the long-term unemployed. You start to get very frustrated with the fact that you can't work out why some people continue to be unemployed. So what was the next step then in terms of the behavioural science part?
Well, I got into something called solutions-focused conversations, because it became apparent that when I sat down and did one-to-ones, which is where I really learned what was going on, and also learned what I was telling my staff to do was not practical. So for example, one of the things, so we looked at solutions focused approaches and conversations, because what happens with a conversation is it becomes barriers focused. Why haven't you done this? Why can't you do that? What do we need to overcome? And then your entire focus becomes on these issues and problems and failings that seem to get bigger and bigger and more insurmountable. Whereas if you talk about somebody's strengths or solutions or how things have worked in the past, then they become almost irrelevant.
Yeah.
But one of the things that an amazing moment for me was when I sat down and listened, and nearly everybody, as soon as a job seeker would come in and sit there and go, "Oh, how are you going?" like it's just a natural thing to do. But I never once heard out of hundreds of job seekers go, "Oh, I'm great. I love being unemployed. Life's brilliant at the moment."
Yeah.
It's an invitation to start listing their problems, because that job seeker's just like me or you. They're embarrassed to be there, and they're trying to communicate the fact that if you were given the same circumstances I'm going through right now, it'd be you sitting here and not me. So yeah, the dog's really ill and I can't do this, and I haven't been able to insure the car, so I can't get in. And then the whole conversation becomes a downward spiral of all their issues and problems, just by saying, "Oh, how's it going?"
Yeah.
So I drummed it into my staff. I took them all out and got them all training in this solutions focused technique. And the one thing I kept saying to everyone: don't say how you're going when someone sits down. So then I went and I thought, I'm gonna show them, that I'll muck in and do this. So I went to our Croydon office. And
Croydon in London?
It's Croydon in South London, and sat down.
So I've never been to Croydon. Croydon, sort of an area of high unemployment?
Yes, relatively, yeah. So it's an urban metropolitan area, and so I sat down, and almost the whole, weirdly, none of the other staff had appointments first thing in the morning. They were all just sitting there quietly, listening out for what I was up to with this first client that came in. So anyway, they came in, they sat down, and I said, "All right, mate, how's it going?"
We might re-record that bit.
You said we could swear.
I don't know if you go on YouTube or not. You went, gosh!
Gosh! You can beep that out. And everyone started laughing because I just fell into it. It was just so natural, and yet I've been telling everyone off not to do that.
Yeah.
So you can see so many layers.
It's so hard to break those natural behaviours, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can't not ask someone how's it going. So how did you recover from that?
Well, I sacked myself, and no, everyone laughed, and then we had to come up with, what you've been up to, or what's been going well, which sounds really awkward.
Yeah.
But it's not. Once the person stops thinking, "Oh, that was a weird question," they start actually thinking, "Oh, how do I answer this?" So, what's gone well since I saw you last? And it just starts things in an upward spiral.
So you then finished with that company, and you moved to Australia, and actually created a company that specialises in behavioural science, nudge theory, and how to activate and ask those questions of unemployed people. How did you go about developing that and rolling that out?
Yeah, it was. So I sold that business to a division of a large university that was getting into government employment services, and then so I just wanted to focus on what works, what doesn't, consult and apply for employment services, what we'd found out and tested worked or not, and then that formed the basis of my PhD on behavioural change in the unemployed. And what works, what doesn't, isn't always, it's counterintuitive sometimes, but hadn't really been researched. So these strengths-based approaches, as I said, we know that they work better. And people often say, we take a strengths-based approach, but what is it? How do you ask the questions? How do you impart that? Because you can't make an unemployed person get a job. You can't. They've got to want to do it themselves. Obviously, we all know that. But when you say to people, "What do you do?" "Oh, I make people get jobs in the sector." It's you've slipped into it. How do you facilitate the other person learning? And some of the things we mentioned in other podcasts, using first names in communications, social norming, saying, "Oh, do you want to come along to this jobs fair?" Oh God, that would be awkward. It's like there's 32 other people already popping down, and half of those got a job.
That social norming is huge, isn't it? Where you say to someone something as simple as, most people come to the job fair. Most people that want to come, most people that use our services want to come to the job fair. So you actually then socially norm.
Yes. That
ability. Because one of the things that you've often talked to me about in terms of how we can support the long-term unemployed is that social norming in the family, that actually getting a job in a multi-generational unemployment sort of situation is actually getting a job is not supported by the family. You often talk about the young man who will go downstairs and his dad will sort of berate him or laugh at him for having a suit on and going to an interview. So how do we challenge those sort of social norms?
Yeah, but that's something that you mentioned in the intro, and that's called in-group. We all form these in-groups, and they might be like really weird people, like Liverpool supporters. And even if you agree with something a Manchester United supporter says, you wouldn't admit that while you're chatting to them. You'd mock them and run them down. And if somebody tries to extract themselves from your in-group, you will also mock them, run them down, take the mickey, as we say in England. But we trust and we feel supported and we feel boosted somehow by being in an in-group. It's an old survival clan-like behaviour. But if that young man is trying to get a job, so the story with that up in Bundaberg was he went for
Queensland, Australia.
Yes,
you get around.
Well, there's a rum factory there, so.
Right.
But he went, his dad mocked him. He said, "Oh, you look ridiculous. You know, you're wearing that suit. You've slicked down your surfer dude hair. You look ridiculous. You make a complete fool of yourself." And then that same dad will go down to the pub, bump into a sort of an associate or friend at 11 a.m. as soon as it opens. He was knocking back a Jack Daniels, wearing a suit, and done his hair up. And the dad says to his mate, he said, "Why are you all dressed up?" And the bloke goes, "Oh, I've got an interview." And the dad will go, "Oh, you look $1 million, you'll knock them dead." And so what's clear is that there's a family in-group, tight-knitting group, but it doesn't quite extend to loose contacts. Close friends, it would be there. So that boy, now the dad wants that boy to succeed. He loves him, wants him to do well, but his knee-jerk, human, base reaction, without thinking about things, is, "Oh, you're going to look, you look stupid." It is to undermine him.
So if people that work then in the employment sector who are trying to help long-term unemployed people, how can they support that young man or even the dad or other parts of that family? Because if it is the social norm in that family, that in-group is to not work, what can be done to challenge that, through the use of behavioural science?
It's a recognition which governments are increasingly recognising that the resilience needed, more than a qualification, more than a lot of things we think we have to impart, hygiene factors in order to get a job, is the resilience to overcome that mockery and the family not seeming to not support you. This is why you get so many dropouts from work in the first few weeks, why you get so many people dropping out of interviews when you phone them up the day before and they really keyed up for it. And why we were researching how to address that, we said, look, just tell them the family are going to mock them, or tell them in the first few weeks you're going to want to drop out of work. It's just going to seem so confusing and horrible, but don't. Stay for a month so at least you've got something to put in your resume.
So it's as simple as that, actually. You're building that resilience for them to accept the fact that they potentially be mocked or ridiculed for having an interview, for having a job. It's actually doing that pre-work to make sure they're ready for that.
Yeah, it's almost stress inoculation therapy. It's norming and familiarising people so that when it happens, it's not unexpected. They said Dad was going to take the mickey out of me. They said I'd want to chuck it in. Well, I will chuck it in after I've achieved a month. And then by the time the month's up, it's what was I thinking? This isn't so bad. So people often stay on. But and we didn't expect that to work. Just telling people, I expect it to happen. It's going to happen. But it actually, anecdotally, from the people that implemented this, because we couldn't do a control group and a proper academic study, but they said it seemed to double turn-up rates to interview or halve dropout rates.
The other example you talked about, just talk to me about this idea of these rich we say public school boys in the UK, but rich private school boy in the hood in London. What was that story around engaging within groups?
It comes out of this learning that there's an in-group of the long-term unemployed. That then influences how tactics and strategies. So we said to employment consultants, look, align yourself with somebody so that they believe, that sort of they listen to you, because when you're from an out group, you don't listen to somebody. So if you say, when I was unemployed, what I found worked for me was blah, 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 suddenly they're thinking, you're not just sitting on your high horse, you know what I'm going through to some extent. So align yourself. Now, there was this guy working for us, he'd been through public schools in Britain, which are...
Public school being private schools in most countries.
Logically.
Yeah.
And he was a lovely guy, and he wanted to work and make a difference, and so he was working with job seekers again in South London on a youth programme, to engage disengaged youth that had never worked before, often in gangs and what have you. So he said, align yourself with them, become part of their in-group so that they trust you and listen to you
See,
more.
this is going already.
Yeah, so he literally said to them, when I was in the hood doing crack, when he was talking to them, and like 2 people out of his group of 10 turned up to the next session.
Yeah.
So it turned out that there's this bias, this heuristic, I guess, of in-group and social norming, but that's outweighed by authenticity. If it's clearly not authentic, then you don't listen to somebody, you lose any credibility.
Okay. So I visioned with a baseball cap on back to front and a tweed jacket.
Probably.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing we talked about, and there's so much we could talk about in this area, and I'm sure we'll cover this in lots of other podcasts, because there's so much help that you can give the employment services sector to engage better with job seekers and to break a lot of those norms and to help activate them into employment. But one of the things we sort of joked about at the start is, do employers hate the unemployed? And inevitably, one of the things your dad will always say to you when you first get a job, or if you want to move from a job, as a kid, is, don't leave that job, son, until you've got another job. And it's such a common thing to say. So what is this notion then about employers and business not liking unemployed?
Well, actually, there are a few studies in this area, but these are sectors that spend billions of dollars, billions of pounds, billions of euros a year in each nation, and yet there's really limited evidence. So you're supposed to be doing evidence-based interventions, but there's very little actual studies. But one study, there's been several studies on employers. Would you give a long-term unemployed person a chance? And invariably, overwhelmingly, they say yes.
But is that also a behavioural science thing where you don't want to stand there and say no?
There is an element of that, but these are confidential, and they would see it genuinely in their heart of hearts, altruistically. They do want to give somebody a chance. But the reality is, when you've got a pile of resumes this big and you've got to choose and select, what happens is social norming, social acceptance kicks in. If they haven't worked for 2 years, there must be something wrong with them. Other people have judged them, and so I don't have to, and I haven't got time to give everyone a chance. I've got plenty of applications. I'm going to select these people to interview. Yeah. And there was a further study by Gayad that found out that even if you're short-term unemployed, under 6 months unemployed, if you applied for a job, and that they controlled for name, ethnicity, and experience and what have you. If you went for a job and you had experience in that role, you had a 16% callback rate for interviews. But if you went beyond 6 months, that plummeted to about 3.5% callback rate. Yeah. And in fact, if you were short-term unemployed and had no experience, you had a 9% callback rate. So what we're seeing is employers would rather take on somebody with no experience in that role, as long as they haven't been unemployed for more than 6 months.
And in a minute, we're going to wrap up, and I'm going to ask you for maybe 2 or 3 things that you would say to people in my sector to help them use the work that you do to support long-term unemployed people into employment. So I'll let you sort of dwell on that as I speak. What you've just talked about, though, is that similar to this notion? I believe there's been some research where we are so focused as government on training the unemployed, but training doesn't necessarily lead to employment outcomes.
Yeah, so somebody could have a chemical engineering degree or something. If they don't want to work, they won't work. So it's getting to the reasons why they might not want to work. Right. And it's usually psychosocial reasons rather than market forces or
So before skills. We start putting in interventions then around training and sort of saying, let's help these long-term unemployed people, let's get them, various licenses and so on, whatever that sector might be, we actually need to first of all tackle issues as to why they won't work, break those social norms to support them.
Yeah, and they're not mutually exclusive. You can do them at the same time. So this really comes on to sort of two takeaways, really for policymakers as much as anything, is that when we're frightened, when we're threatened by something, it's one of the greatest motivators. There's fight, flight, or freeze. So we'll run away or we'll fight. We'll become empowered to do something about it, but only when we feel capable. Otherwise, we go into that freeze bit and we do nothing. So if you over-frighten someone with sanctions, or you're never going to get a job, you're never going to be able to get married or get a car unless you go and get a job, and they don't feel capable of getting a job, then they won't. And it will instill learned helplessness. So you need to also at the same time instill interview skills, conversation skills, qualifications, to give them a feeling that they're capable, identify what their strengths are, so that they're feeling like they're in a front foot, not a scarcity back foot. Yeah. So that's the key thing. You know, fear is massively motivational as long as somebody feels capable of addressing that fear.
Yeah.
So it's that capability. And the second very quick one is that we touched on. If you remove choice and control, a sense of autonomy, then people will push back against it. So work.
And this is something we talked about in previous episodes around, things like vaccination mandates, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yes, and if you say to somebody, you have to do this job in order to get your benefits, even if that person really wants to work and actually fancied doing that job, but if it's forced upon them, they'll push back against it, they'll resent it, they'll do what they can to sabotage that and themselves. But if you say, oh look, you've got to do a job to keep it, but here are 2 or 3 options. Do you want to go here, here, or here? Suddenly that little bit of choice makes them feel more in control, less threatened survivally and basely, and it will be a lot more effective. So to sum up today's episode, in-groups are powerful, so suggest you've been there if you want credibility within that group. Humans, however, have an acute authenticity radar. You must be authentic. Employers subconsciously favour those who are already employed or only short-term unemployed. So you improve your chances of an interview by at least 400% if you're working in any job or recently left a job. And finally, I guess fear is a great motivator for action, but only if you feel capable. If you don't feel that you have the resources, it will have the opposite effect, and fear will result in learned helplessness.
Mate, I think this is one we talk about so much because there's so much work to be done in for the long-term unemployed, the employment sector. But thank you for that. I know we're going to talk about this lots and lots in future episodes. If you like what we're talking about, then please throw us a like, subscribe on YouTube or whichever platform you're listening to this podcast on. Thank you, Darren, Dr. Darren, and thanks for listening or watching.